Sabotaged. After spending close to 10 hours strapped down in the security chair, a female lieutenant came to the door and finally talked me into letting the officers pull me out and take me back to my housing. Up until that point, the sergeant I rushed was coming to the door every 2 hours, asking me if I was ready to go back. But I just kept telling him to get away from the door. When members of the ERT, Emergency Response Team, were taking me out of the chair, they told me that I had been rehoused back in the observation cell at 3rd West, the same cell I was in before I moved to South Max. I later found out that Stretch, Looney, Manos, and a few of the other homeboys had all been moved to the 4th floor after boarding up, barricading their doors to block all visibility into the cell, and refusing to come out of their cells. After my incident, and after everybody else was returned to their cells, some of the homeboys were upset about the way their personal belongings had been disrespected. Supposedly, the search team tore pictures, dumped out hygiene items on the floor, and trashed a lot of their personal property. In response, they boarded up. As a result, they were pepper sprayed and physically removed from their cells. Jail staff later claimed that they did this as a show of support and solidarity for me, but it actually had nothing to do with me. Lencho was one of the few who didn't get involved and wasn't moved. During the time I was in the observation cell, I had a chance to talk to Dela Cruz a lot more openly since I was no longer on the tier with everyone else. When I was on the tier in 2nd East, I used to keep my contact with him and Cobb real brief and limited, as I didn't want to draw any more unnecessary attention to myself. But now that I was in the observation cell, it was easier to talk with them without having to worry about what other people thought. He'd either come up to my door and talk, or he'd take me downstairs to the ODR and we talked down there. Dela Cruz's position was still angled toward getting me to cooperate, but now he started to push a lot harder. One obvious reason was the possibility or chance to enjoy freedom again. More importantly, Dela Cruz began telling me about some of the intel that they had intercepted, specifically relating to me. One of the letters intercepted was an outgoing letter written by an individual named Chris Carrasco. The letter was apparently addressed to James Conejo Perez in the Bay, which implied that I was cooperating with the feds. A second letter written by David Sombras Villagrana in Corcoran to Paul Smiley Lopez was a filter advising him that I was no good and that I was cooperating. Smiley was back in the jail on an attempted murder for shooting at some Sureños. And of course, some of Lencho's correspondences were indicative that I was cooperating working with the FBI. Finding out about all this really upset me and was discouraging, but I still wasn't ready to give it up yet. At that point, I spent close to 4 years trying to convince all these dudes that I hadn't cooperated, but they still didn't believe me. It was difficult to be on these active tiers with 18 and 19-year-old kids, finding myself in a position that I had to explain myself to them. This bothered me in the worst way, because some of these dudes were straight nobodies who I knew were on borrowed time themselves. Some of these cats were given tier security positions or some other type of paltry position within the household and automatically began thinking they were now some sort of prominent hardcore gang member down for the cause. It was toilsome at times and took every bit of self-discipline I could muster, but I rolled with the punches and bore through it because all that really mattered to me was clearing my name. But it really began to feel like I was fighting a losing battle. No matter what I did, what I said, how far I went to prove myself, people seemed to be dead set on seeing me fail. And this was in light of the fact that there still were no police reports or anything else to go on other than my phone calls. Dela Cruz continued to pound all this in and illustrated the whole schism to me. But I still wasn't convinced that cooperating was the best choice for me. I told him that my mind wasn't completely closed to it, but I just didn't want to give up like that. After everything I went through to get where I wasn't about to lay it down and tap out like that. I told him I wanted to go back to 2nd East and force the issue back on these dudes. If they were really going to try to whack me, then I wanted to at least give them the chance to try. I didn't want to be viewed as a coward who punked out. I wanted them to try. Dela Cruz said he'd let me go back if that's what I really wanted, but thought my chances were better if he moved Lencho, Weddle, and another one of Lencho's supporters, Frank Joker Ruiz, back to the 4th floor. They had all moved down there after Stretch, Looney, and Manos moved out. Weddle and Joker were both Lencho's strongest supporters and also his co-defendants. Coincidentally, William Flacco Vick from Milpitas began working with law enforcement and agreed to wear a wire while conducting illegal transactions with these three. He purchased a gun from Lencho, an ounce of PCP from Joker, and a pound of meth from Weddle, and now all three of them were fighting this case. After talking to Dela Cruz, I told him it really didn't matter if he moved them or not. I just wanted to go back. While I was still in the observation cell, I also found out through a CO who was working 3rd West that Turtle was housed in Little Max and had been asking about me. According to this CO, Turtle was at an impasse and was still thinking about what he wanted to do after being propositioned by Livingston. The CO said, "He thinks highly of you and wants you to know he didn't mean to say anything to hurt you." I responded, "Send my regards back to him and tell him not to worry about it." I was buried before he made those statements. Then I motioned for him to come a little closer to the door so nobody could hear me. I said, "Look, tell him I said to do what he's got to do for his family. I'm not holding nothing against him, and his priority should be his kids." Even though I was still trying to remain active, there was a touch of morality about this, and I honestly meant it. I was resigned to spend the rest of my life in prison, but if Turtle could turn his life around by testifying against me, then by all means, he should do it and get himself out of the situation he was in. Later, Turtle would tell me that when the CO relayed my message to him, it gave him the push that he needed, and from that day forward, he began cooperating. Prior to moving back to 2nd East, Dela Cruz moved Lencho, Weddle, and Joker back to the 4th floor. At the same time, he moved Stretch, Looney, Manos, and Bones back down to 2nd East. Bones had just come back on a murder charge and had only been back for about a month. I knew this was going to look suspicious because these were all the homeboys who had been supporting me, but this was my only option and was Dela Cruz's call. Once I got back down there and settled back in, Stretch shot me a kite, which said that after I left, Lencho took his position and stripped him. He said Lencho told him it was for getting drunk and for abandoning his post. But I knew Lencho was just using that for an excuse. Stretch told me that he refused to relinquish his position in the beginning and held out for as long as he could, but in the end, Lencho threatened to deem him. Aside from that, Lencho had apparently reprimanded them all for being too loose with me and for their continued support, while DB was down there vouching for me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He admonished them for being too loose with me, but they all saw firsthand what he exposed to me. But I knew it was just a matter of time before this dude started up his bullshit. Sometime in the latter part of September, Looney received a filter from Joker advising him that per Lencho, he was on freeze for calling a female by the name of Tina Marie Roman, who was the wife of Carlos Roman, one of Lencho's street regiment members. Apparently, Looney had been calling her and was carrying on with her behind Carlos's back. A few days later, Looney ran into Lencho in the court tunnel and asked him why he was put on freeze. Lencho flat out denied ever telling Joker to filter this out. When Looney came back from court that day, Mono shot me a kite and told me everything that happened. I got back at him and told him exactly what to expect. Wait a couple days and you'll get another filter confirming that Looney's on freeze. Trust me, this is classic Lencho. He doesn't have the balls to look you in the eyes and tell you himself, but I guarantee you that he's going to have something sent back down here on paper. I added, he'll probably also start pushing my issue again too. A couple days later, Manos knocked on my wall and said, "Hey B, remember what you said old boy would send down? Well, we just got it, and you called it to a T." Aside from freezing Looney, he also froze Manos, Bones, and Stretch. He froze Bones over an unpaid debt on the streets, Stretch for defying a direct order, and Manos for not following directives. But I knew what he was really doing. He was taking away all my support and was trying to isolate me. A few days after receiving that filter, Vinny Monster Thierry and Ronnie Short Reed were both moved down there with us from the 4th floor. The last time I saw either one of them was back in 2004 when they were functioning in my regiment. Since then, a lot of things had obviously changed. Monster and I were always real close, and we had a lot of history together. But things were starting to get real obtrusive down there, so I had to be very calculated about the way I put myself out there. As far as I was concerned, Everybody was suspect, and I had to be on my toes. About a week after Monster and Shorty showed up, I went out to the yard one afternoon with Looney and Manos. When we got to the yard, they both pulled me over and told me something that made me realize everything I had done up until that point was for nothing. All my efforts, all my attempts at proving that I was still loyal and determined to keep pushing forward was being furtively sabotaged. They told me Lencho had just circulated another filter indicating that I was an informant, that I had been an informant, and that he strongly believed that I was working with law enforcement. I was so pissed after hearing this, I didn't even know what to say. They didn't believe shit Lencho said, and a lot of homeboys were still pulling for me. They said, "Don't let that fool discourage you, B. You'll get it cleared up once you touch down in the Bay." But I was discouraged, and I began to have real doubts about whether or not I would be able to ever put this behind me. For the first time in almost 18 years after committing myself to the organization, I asked myself, why in the fuck are you trying so hard to stay loyal to a bunch of people who are obviously bent on seeing you fail? I had never questioned my own loyalty up until that point, but it was really beginning to look like the scales of justice were not going to weigh out for me. This began to push me in the other direction, but I was still determined to make these fools try to hit me, and when they did, I would be ready for it. Sometime in the middle of October, DB came back into the jail after Livingston conducted a parole search at his house and found a hypodermic syringe within the vicinity of his apartment. Dela Cruz moved him back to 2nd East in the cell next door to me. Seeing DB gave me a temporary spark of hope, but by this time, I'd been pushed and pulled so much that I didn't really care what was going to happen. I had been fighting these demons close to 4 years now. I was fed up with trying to convince everybody that I was still holding my mud. I argued from every conceivable angle, but it kept falling on deaf ears. If I had cooperated early on back in 2004 like everybody suspected, then why was I still there? Why didn't I cooperate against any of my co-defendants? If I had cooperated within those first 3 weeks while I was still in that observation cell, then why did I still get indicted almost a year later? Why weren't there any police reports? Why were they still amending charges on me? All these questions were valid, but I still wasn't being given the benefit of the doubt. And there was no due process. The truth was that I was not cooperating. I hadn't given up any information on anybody, and I was still holding my mud. I did everything I could to prove myself, but in the end, none of it was enough. In November 2007, Livingston dropped a hammer on 16 members and associates that operated under Jaime Stick-em-Up Kramer's regiment. Those indicted were Jaime Stick-em-Up Kramer, Rodolfo Dancing Bear Miramontes, Luis Looney Rodriguez, Frank Manos Gutierrez, Eric Listo Burns, Jose Spray de Santiago, Robert Pretty Boy Talavera, Ronnie Shorte Reith, Jeremy Lokes Pagely, Damian Chon Mendez, Shelby Huerta Thornhill, Alicia Huerta Silva, Carol Salgado, Vanessa Carrasco, Jackie Limones, and Marcela Marin. This indictment was an instant morale killer. Everyone indicted was stressed out the game. A lot of the females were associates and nothing more than mules. Manos actually had his girlfriend and the mother of his newborn child both indicted along with them. Now everybody began wondering why the same cop who had gotten me was still snooping around and conducting these types of investigations. It definitely raised their suspicions about what I was up to and whether or not I might have been a plant working for him, especially since most of those indicted were right there on the tier with me. Sometime in December, after they were all indicted, the yard officers came on the tier one evening and asked Monster, Shorty, Looney, Manos, and I if we all wanted to go to the yard. After they cuffed me up and I exited my cell, I walked halfway down the tier and stopped in front of cell 208. Robert Spanky Sanchez and Pete Pistolas Flores occupied this cell. As I stood there, waiting for the other four to get cuffed up, something caught my attention out of the side of my eye to my left, a quick movement. When I turned my head to see what it was, I saw Spanky standing on his gate with a long, tightly rolled up piece of paper protruding from his gate. He was making jabby motions towards me as if to poke me with it. When I looked at it, I thought it was a channel changer because it had a flat tip on it. A channel changer is a long, tightly rolled up piece of paper in sections used to change the channel on the TV because we were on a maximum security tier and the TVs are mounted up on the wall outside of the cells. In order to change the channel, the extension has to be long enough to navigate through the bars to reach the TV. I actually thought he was playing, but the expression on his face indicated he was serious, and this makeshift contraption was supposed to be a spear. Aside from it being about a foot too short and no tip on it, I knew Spanky really didn't want any part of this. His whole objective was obviously to do it right in front of the COs and cause a scene so they'd move me. It was also his way of outwardly displaying that the order was carried out. It didn't even come close to me, but even though I knew he really didn't want to do it and was more than likely just honoring the directive that Lencho sent them, it still upset me. When I looked in the cell, Pistolas was standing all the way in the back of the cell and gave me that look like I ain't involved. And it was obvious that Spanky was scared. He was the youngest, most inexperienced homeboy on that tier, but yet they gave him an assignment like this. I found out later that they were in the cell arguing about who was going to do it all day. Spanky was finally forced to do it, but both were supposed to participate. I didn't understand this. They would have gotten better results if one of the four going to the yard with me had brought out a loose razor. Even with handcuffs on, one of them could have reached around and got a good slice in. Even if it would have just been an arm shot. When I looked at Spanky, I said, "What the fuck is that, you little punk? You serious?" It played out almost identical to how it did when Pony tried to throw the phone at me. I kicked his tray slot and said, "Man, you guys should really be ashamed of yourselves. First I get taken out with the phone, and now I get attacked with the channel changer. Why didn't you guys just try it on the yard?" At this point, I knew it was over. Nobody said nothing. The tier stayed completely silent. It really didn't bother me when I walked off the tier in AdSeg the first time because I had already disconnected myself. But this time was different. I liked a lot of these homeboys in 2nd East, and I knew they did what they could to help me. I eventually walked off the tier that night, and it actually felt like all my ties were being cut with every step I took. When I reached the end of the tier and walked through the front gate, I knew it was over. I was done trying to stay loyal to these cats.